Okay, so today's lesson is on 3.3, studying organisms in ecosystems. All right, so here, just an introduction to our topic. Here we have snails that can be found in many different habitats, but the snails in Banff National Park are unique. These snails are a different species than those you might find in Waterton Lakes National Park. So there are abiotic factors and there are also biotic factors that we've talked about. So different abiotic factors affect each park's aquatic and terrestrial environments, creating different habitats for organisms in which to live. So these different environments are going to suit different species. So for example, thermal springs are found in Banff National Park, and these thermal springs it's very hot water. So this unique hot water environment is the only place in the world where this specific snail, the Banff spring snail, Ficella johnsoni, can be found. But because this habitat is in danger, this snail is on the endangered species list. And you may have seen this when you go to Banff and you go to the cave-in basin. You may have seen this snail there. So abiotic factors determine where life exists and how it's distributed. And then biotic components determine how an organism interacts with other organisms to ensure their survival. So again, abiotic factors include all the non-living components like temperature, climate, and water and air quality, and so on. So abiotic factors cause weather conditions. That's referred to as climate. So the unequal heating of the Earth's atmosphere causes major climate zones and produces air and water currents that interact with physical features like mountains and islands and lakes to produce rainfall patterns. And then all of these and other factors create larger areas with similar environmental conditions, and those are called biomes. So for example, at higher elevations on Mount Athabasca in Jasper National Park, the temperature drops. And this is part of the taiga biome, a cold mountain forest. So the change in biomes as you increase in altitude, it's similar to the change in biomes that occurs as you increase in latitude towards the North Pole. So let's take a look at the diagram on the next page here. So here, looking at the equator right here, and then we've got the North Pole up here, and then we've got all the biomes represented there. Polar ice, tundra, taiga, temperate forest, tropical rainforest. And then here we can see our elevation from sea level to 3,500 meters, polar ice, the tundra, the taiga, the temperate forest, and then the tropical rainforest. So there are fewer living things closer to the mountain summit. Fewer organisms are able to survive at a high altitude and low temperatures. The same decrease in the numbers of species occurs from the equator to the North Pole. And it's because of the decreases in average temperature, average solar radiation, and average precipitation that occur closer to Earth's poles. Looking at the graph here, so we can see that close to the equator in Central America, right here, there are more species of animals. All right, so number of mammalian animals or species on the left-hand side, and then decreasing latitude. The increase in temperature and the available energy and precipitation in this location allows for more diverse set of organisms to flourish, and that's why we see that increase in the number of species. All right, so just some questions here. Question number 1, what is the relationship between temperature and precipitation and the abundance of life in a terrestrial biome? So basically, the higher the temperature and the greater the amount of precipitation, the greater abundance of terrestrial life. But keep in mind that very high temperatures can inhibit growth. Question 2, why is there uneven heating of the Earth's surface? So that has to do with the Earth being spherical. Because it's a spherical in shape, sunlight strikes Earth unevenly. The equator receives the most direct and intense light. Then as you move towards the poles, sunlight is spread over large areas and becomes more diffuse. Question 3, what other factors besides precipitation and rainfall determine the abundance of photosynthetic organisms? So other factors, topography, the altitude, the latitude, the temperature, will all determine the types and abundance of photosynthetic organisms that can survive in a biome, and that includes like soil conditions, nutrients in the soil as well. True or false, there are transition zones between biomes. That is true. It's not like a direct change from one biome to the other. There's a transition zone between biomes. All right, next we're going to talk about habitats. So all organisms require specific abiotic factors in order to survive. For example, most animals survive, most animals have a range where they can survive under, and they can't survive generally if the temperature is above 45 degrees Celsius. Some bacteria are found living in hot springs and temperatures greater than 100 degrees Celsius, as well as that snail that we talked about can live in hot springs. So these necessary abiotic and biotic factors determine a species' habitat. And the habitat, the location of a habitat will determine a species' range. And then an organism living in its habitat, they have a role to play. And this role is called the niche, the organism's niche. And it has certain biotic and abiotic needs in order to survive. But the niche is basically the role of an organism. Is it a predator? Is it a prey? Where does it fit in a food web? And so on. Many organisms can share habitats because they have different niches. For example, a forest will have a canopy of tall coniferous trees that require large amounts of sunlight, and ground cover plants where little light gets through. And then some organisms, such as the tree swallow, the little brown bat, they have overlapping niches, but they partition food resources by hunting at different times of the day. So for example, they might be nocturnal, which means maybe they're hunting at nighttime. Animals with a very small niche, such as the panda bear that eats only bamboo, they might have usually they have a higher risk of becoming endangered, because if they run out of that food source, they're not adapted to eating other food sources. So since the animal's niche, its role and resource requirements is smaller, it would be greatly affected by one food source disappearing. And therefore, it would have a limited range due to having a less diverse diet. All right, let's take a look at some more questions here. So question 1, so this is a matching question, matching each term with the statement that best describes it. So let's look at our first statement here. The hoary marmot can be found in Alaska, Alberta, and the northwestern United States. All right, so that we would have to match it to either the biome, habitat, niche, or range. Our second statement, the hoary marmot lives in the alpine and subalpine. Third statement, the hoary marmot lives in the alpine and subalpine areas of North America. Its diet includes grasses and wildflowers, and it is a prey for many predators. And the last one, a large portion of the Canadian North is considered tundra. All right, so matching these terms here, the biome is going to represent this tundra statement. A large portion of the Canadian North is considered tundra. Habitat would be that the hoary marmot lives in the alpine and subalpine. The niche includes all of the roles So it lives in the alpine and subalpine areas of North America. Its diet is grasses and wildflowers, and it's also a prey for many predators. That is the role. So that would be its niche. And then the last one, the range, is that the marmot can be found in Alaska, Alberta, and the northwestern United States. All right, 2 more questions here. We're looking at a graph. The green bar graph represents precipitation, and then the red line graph represents temperature. And then we have months here on the bottom on the x-axis. So above is the climatograph. What abiotic factors are being measured in a climatograph? Choose all that apply. So like I said, it's temperature and precipitation. So the answer would be A, precipitation, and D, temperature. Question 3, in this area, what month has the greatest precipitation? So looking at the bar graph, it would be July. July has the greatest precipitation. All right, so in summary for what we've discussed, abiotic factors influence climate and create areas called biomes with a particular set of abiotic and biotic characteristics. Within these biomes, we have habitats that meet the specific biotic and abiotic needs of some organisms. Then the range of an organism is the geographical area where the organism is found in its habitat. And then within an ecosystem, there are many habitats and niches that overlap. An animal's niche is the interactions the animal has with the biotic and abiotic factors in its habitat. The niche includes all the roles that it plays in that ecosystem. All right, so next we're going to talk about limiting factors. So let's just look at this diagram here. So we have a grizzly bear and her cubs, and they are foraging for food. The amount of food that's available for them at this particular location will affect their health and behavior. If there isn't enough food, they might have to move to a different location, or they might have to change their food sources. If they are still not able to find sufficient nutrition, their health may start to deteriorate. So in this part of the lesson, we're looking at how do limiting factors influence the distribution and range of organisms, and how do biologists monitor population size. So limiting factors. Any abiotic or biotic factors in an ecosystem that's going to affect the growth, survival, and distribution of an organism, those are called the limiting factors. All right, so living organisms, they have the ability to produce populations of infinite size if they're allowed to reproduce with infinite resources and space. But environments and resources are finite. There's a limited amount of it. So as a result, populations have a carrying capacity, which is a population size at which the population will cease growing. And as population size fluctuates, interactions between organisms are also affected. So abiotic limiting factors, these are the abiotic components of an ecosystem that limit the distribution and size of the populations that live there. So for example, plants, they have an optimum set of abiotic requirements, including the type of soil, moisture, humidity levels, and temperature range. So the populations of plants are controlled by these abiotic requirements. All right, so let's take a look at a few questions here. Question 1, hypothesize why trembling aspen does not live everywhere in Canada. So a hypothesis for that, they do not live everywhere in Canada because they require certain growing conditions, which will be dictated by their abiotic factors. Again, temperature, humidity, moisture levels, soil type, and so on. Why is unlimited growth impossible? Because there are limiting factors. Populations can't have sustainable long-term unlimited growth because of limiting factors. Limiting factors lessen the number of individuals of the population. Question 3, what abiotic factors will limit the growth of greenhouse tomatoes? So things like soil, the nutrients in the soil, the temperature, the moisture, the humidity, the altitude, amount of carbon dioxide, and the available solar energy. Those are all examples of abiotic factors that would limit the growth of greenhouse tomatoes. Question 4, what biotic factors would cause population growth to slow? This time we're looking at biotic factors. All right, so there's competition. So population growth would slow because of competition within a species, competition between species for resources, predation, parasitism. Those are also other biotic factors that would slow down population growth. Question 5, identify and explain the limiting effects of introducing Arctic foxes to the Aleutian Islands. All right, so we're introducing foxes. All right, so because fox are a predator, there would be a predator-prey relationship between the Arctic foxes and the seabirds on the islands. And that would be the limiting effect. The introduction of the foxes limited the population of seabirds, almost to the point of extinction. The loss of the seabirds and their guano, which is seabird droppings, led to the loss of grasslands and all the organisms that depended on the grassland habitat for survival. So we can see here the effect that introducing the foxes had to the islands. It affected the seabirds, it also affected the grass, and it also affected all the other organisms that depended on that grassland habitat. All right, so biotic limiting factors are the living components, any living components that will limit the growth of populations. So for example, if the number of births in a population is greater than the number of deaths, the population is growing. If the number of deaths is greater, the population will decrease. All right, so like we talked about, there's competition. That's part of the biotic limiting factors. So there's two types of competition. It's within a species, and it's going to be between species. So when a population reaches a certain size, where individuals have to start competing for resources like space, food, mates, shelter, or water, that's intraspecific competition. This is where members of the same population and species are competing with each other. Interspecific competition is when individuals from different species are competing for resources, and it's usually when species are living in the same habitat, but they might have different niches, and then when this occurs, then the chance for competition will decrease. So again, maybe hunting at different times, for example, like nocturnal. So here, intraspecific, this is happening within a species. So for example, we have male elk here competing for mates. The winner will be desirable mate since its characteristics will be passed on to its offspring. And then here we have interspecific competition. Zebras and oryx, they compete for the same water and food resources. So there's two different species here. All right, predator-prey relationships are part of biotic limiting factors. So predators and prey are going to have impacts on each other's populations. For example, if the number of prey is reduced, maybe because of a food shortage, this would also decrease the food supply for predators. An increase in the number of predators or the introduction of an invasive predator will also cause fewer prey species. Example here are wolves. They are fierce predators that affect many populations, including the elk, which is shown in this picture here. Next are parasites or parasitic relationship. So parasites get food and protection from their host. The host species is the one that's getting harmed. This relationship is very different from predator-prey because the host does not get consumed. Just their survival or ability to reproduce gets affected. They're not as thriving as they would be without the parasite. Example, ticks. It's a common and widespread parasite. It feeds on the blood of their host. If they're unable to find a host, they will eventually die. Ticks cause Lyme disease in humans, and in Alberta, ticks are also common in ungulate populations like deer, elk, and moose. And next is invasive species. So that's kind of like the example we looked at with the Arctic fox being introduced to the Aleutian Islands. If it's brought there intentionally and it kind of takes over and it becomes a stronger species, it becomes an invasive species. So competition can occur between a native species and a species that have been introduced to an ecosystem. So if an introduced species has no natural predators or diseases to limit their populations, they become an invasive species. And invasive species have a serious impact on native ecosystems because the introduced species may have a niche similar to the niche of a native species, and this is going to cause competition. And it is an example of interspecific competition because it's between two different species. So this competition will limit the population size of the native species, and sometimes the introduced species is a predator, and prey populations will decrease rapidly due to excess predation. So this example here, camels were introduced to Australia between 1840 and 1907 as a way of opening up the desert outback, and camels helped build the rail and the telegraph lines and aided in supplying remote locations. But it was an introduced species, and camels are now harming the native landscape and competing with the native cattle for vegetation. Another example in Canada, problem of exotic species. There's an estimated 800 species of exotic plants living in the wild. This is roughly 16% of all the plants in Canada. So some of the exotic species of plants and animals in Canada include the plant here, purple loosestrife, knapweed, zebra mussels, sea lampreys, and starlings. This example here is the ox-eye daisy, which was introduced to Canada as an ornamental plant for gardens. And its taste makes it undesirable to grazers, and it spreads many seeds each year. It's a very successful invasive species. Conservation in Alberta. Conservation biology is an important field of study to help preserve ecosystems. Conservation efforts range from simple monitoring programs to more elaborate efforts. So for example, the burrowing owl, they are endangered in Alberta. So human land development, pesticide use, and drastic weather conditions have threatened the species' survival. So pest control is an important component of conserving native species. Knapweed, Canada thistle, and ox-eye daisy are some of the invasive weeds that threaten natural grasslands. All right, this is a method that are used by scientists called population sampling. So estimating a population size allows scientists to observe changes in population size and health. Few populations are small enough for scientists to simply just count each individual. So there are some methods that can be used to estimate population size. This is transects or quadrats, and they work well when counting plants or relatively stationary animals like snails. So in this method, the transect method, They use stakes and string to mark out a straight line of a certain length, and then the researcher then walks along the line, counting any individual within 5 meters of that line. A quadrant, it's a small area, usually it's square shape, and then within that, the researcher will count all of the individuals of a certain species. And then usually several quadrants are marked out to obtain a representative sample. Capture-recapture method is another method for estimating populations. So it allows you to estimate the size of a population by catching a small sample, tagging them, and then releasing them. Next step is to recapture a sample of the population and count the number of tagged individuals in the new sample. Then you can use this method here to estimate the total population size. So there's this formula here. It's the number of tagged in the first sample divided by the estimated total population, and it's equal to the number with tags in the second sample and the total number caught in the second sample. You can rearrange that formula then to solve for the estimated total population. Or you can just use cross multiplication. So you're going to multiply number of tagged, multiply it by total number caught in the second sample, and then divide it by the number with tags in the second sample. All right, let's take a look here at some more example questions. So question 1, the main problem with introduced species is that A, they change the pH of the soil so nothing else can grow. B, they compete for resources with native species. C, they are poisonous to other animals. Or D, they are predators and reduce prey population. So the answer here is B. They compete for resources with the native species. Question 2, there's a little bit of reading to do here on red-backed voles. So populations of red-backed voles found throughout much of Canada's boreal forest fluctuate in cycles. Populations peak every 2 to 5 years and then decline sharply before building up again. In one study, researchers measured a density of 398 voles per hectare, which later fell to a density of 27 voles per hectare. Red-backed voles live in a variety of habitats but prefer moist, dense grassland with high soil moisture. They feed on fungi, lichens, seeds, berries, bark, flowers, and other parts of plants. And their predators include owls, hawks, and mammals, such as coyotes. All right, which factor is not likely to be a limiting factor for a population of red-backed voles? So A is flooding, B is drought, C is elk populations, and then D is owl populations. So the answer is elk populations because we can see here their predators are owls, hawks, and other mammals. There's no competition happening with the elk population. Flooding and drought is important because they do require, they prefer moist, dense grassland with high soil moisture. All right, let's take a look at this example 3. We have a sample of 50 crows are caught, tagged with red bands, and released. A week later, a second sample of 20 birds is caught. 3 of the birds in the sample had red leg bands. What is the estimated size of the population? So we're going to use this same formula that we had talked about in the previous slide. So we're going to take number of tagged in the first sample, which was 50. We're going to multiply it by the total number caught in the second sample, which was 20. And then we're going to divide it by 3, which is the number of birds that had tags in the second sample. All right, so 50 times 20 divided by 3, and we get with the answer of 333. So the answer is D. All right, so just in summary then, limiting factors can be any biotic or abiotic factor that controls the size of a population. These factors can affect the population size and density, And then population size can be estimated by taking small samples. It's important that ecologists know the populations of species in national parks. Without this knowledge, an ecologist would not be able to measure and maintain the ecological integrity of parks. So here's just a summary of Chapter 3, everything we've talked about. Ecosystems, it's a community together with abiotic factors and the biotic factors. Here are some examples of abiotic factors. Biotic factors include all the living components. Communities are all the individuals in all of the interacting populations. When we talk about just a population, it's a group of individuals of the same species living in an area at the same time. All right, and then limiting factors that we talked about today, these are abiotic or biotic conditions that control the number of individuals in a population. We also talked about the difference between habitats and niche. The niche is the role that an organism plays. Habitat just is, it's like the place where the species is living. And we also talked about the hierarchical system from domain. Domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then genus, and then species.